Welcome to this week's episode of the 3-Minute Therapy Podcast. I'm Dr. Michael Edelstein, and I'm a clinical psychologist, practitioner of REBT for many years. Excuse me. And REBT stands for Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, the forerunner to cognitive behavior therapy. It was devised by Albert Ellis in 1955. And it's based on the notion that your emotions don't come from situations. So if I'm fired and I'm depressed, I'm not depressed because I was fired. I'm depressed because of what I'm telling myself about being fired. The ideas in my head. And that's a very powerful notion, because if it's your thinking that causes your emotions, then you can change your thinking if you don't like what you're feeling. And that's what we and my colleagues here do as REBT therapists. We help people identify their irrational thinking, usually in the form of musts, shoulds, supposed tos, have tos, awfuls, terribles, self-downing, and can't stand it, and look at things more reasonably and more logically and empirically. Albert Ellis, the founder of REBT, wrote over 80 books. So if you'd like to read more, you can go to Amazon, read books by Albert Ellis, E-L-L-I-S. And I have a few books. The most popular is called 3-Minute Therapy, Change Your Thinking, Change Your Life. I'd like to introduce you to our team today. And first is Chris Rossini, who you won't be seeing, but he's our technical engineer, for whom we're very grateful. And Kevin Benbow is an REBT therapist in Yuma, Arizona. And if you're in that area, insurance will often cover your sessions with Kevin. Is that right, Kevin?
Yes, sir. That's correct.
And our guest today is Niraj Nanal, coming to us straight from India. And Niraj is a student of psychology and of REBT. And Niraj has some questions for us about the theory and practice of rational emotive behavior therapy. So Niraj, would you like to start?
So my first question is regarding the thrust on reason in REBT, and it logically makes sense. But one question I have is, whatever I came across about Freud, and he says, so I will explain it what I really want to say. And one argument given by Freud is that we are human beings are set of sub-personalities, and thinking is just one part of our whole consciousness. So if you consider human consciousness, thinking is just small part of it. Now, just working on that thinking part probably will not able to resolve the deep psychological conflict. One example which I came across is, like, imagine that the owner of the house is a violent and angry person, and all the neighbors are explaining to the security guard of the house that how the anger doesn't make sense, how it is bad, and how it is it is destructive, and blah blah blah. So explaining this to security guard is not going to change the owner in any way. So here, obviously, the metaphor is used, thinking. For security guard is the metaphor is used as a thinking or the rationality part of it, and house owner is what Freud called as deep psychological conflict and the deep early childhood trauma and all those things. So the bottom line of my question is, the reason has limitations, and just working on the reasons will not solve the problem. That is my first question. And second question is, Jordan Peterson, who is kind of a proponent of the Freudian thought, although he does not agree with the whole whole hypothesis and whole submission of Freud. But he says that the Freud was the first person who understood that the unconscious, there are many things in our psyche which we don't have awareness about, and we are set of sub personalities which we thinking may not have control over all these things. So these are my two questions. I hope I have made myself clear.
Okay, well, let's take the first one first, which basically, if we were to shrink it down into what saying without the metaphors and the obfuscation, is that thinking is too superficial and we have to get to the deep underlying conflicts. Probably, this is what Freud said, probably Oedipal conflicts, things that occurred when you were 3 years old and you wanted to have sex with your mother and you were afraid your father was going to castrate you and those kinds of things. So it's necessary to get back to that. So that's a nice fantasy. And Freud was very popular in his day. He was a great salesman, and he did a good job at making up these stories. He also made up stories about how he cured certain clients. One was nicknamed the Wolfman, and many years later, after Freud died, the Wolfman was interviewed, and he said he was never helped by Freud. Freud invented this. So I wouldn't take Freud's word very seriously. The way our emotions work, it comes from our thinking, and yes, sometimes deep thinking, thinking that we've been convincing ourselves for many, many years, in which we, as humans, have genetic predispositions to believe. So it takes a lot of work and practice to change that. But also, in terms of the security guard and the owner, it takes motivation and interest to change it. And I don't know that the owner had much interest in changing his ideas. So the security guard's thinking or other ideas is not going to have much of an impact. So one thing we emphasize in REBT is practice, 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 identifying your irrational ideas, usually in the form of demands, musts, and shoulds, and that we escalate from our strong preferences, and then practicing, questioning, challenging, and contradicting them again and again and again in our head and in writing and in other ways, imagery, behaviorally. So it's not a one-shot magical pill. It's a discipline. And like any other discipline, it takes practice. And I recommend to my clients that they practice. One way is to use what I call a 3-minute exercise, ABCDEF, which Kevin and I have explained in previous podcasts. And you can find in my book, 3-Minute Therapy. So that's pretty much my response. Kevin, did you want to add or?
Yeah, sure. Just one small contribution here. When we're talking about thinking, it's important to know that our thoughts, whether we're calling them irrational beliefs or they're more the inferences, the automatic thoughts, they can happen so quickly that it seems like there's no thinking going on. For example, I'm walking across the street and I see a bus bearing down on me. It seems like all I'm feeling is the emotion that the bus is bearing down on me. Really, it's my appraisal of the situation that's happening very quickly. And this is what the human mind is very good at. We grab a situation and we take these mental shortcuts and we appraise a situation. In this case, there's a bus bearing down on me, and it's better for me to get my ass across the street so I don't get flattened. It's a completely different thing if I happen to look over at my wife and I see that she's texting somebody on her phone, or she's having a conversation with somebody on her phone, and I immediately appraise that she's cheating on me, she's talking to somebody. Of course, that's the activating event. And then my belief must be she shouldn't, it could be something like she shouldn't do that. So it's important to know that these beliefs, we're not talking about someone's just taking the time to think. These things happen automatically, and they are non-conscious processes. And our task as therapists is to help our clients pull these apart so they can see them in action and then change them. So I felt that's an important clarification to make.
I think it is. I think it is. Thanks for that, Kevin. I would use the term habitually rather than automatically, but I think automatically is good too. So you habitually have certain thoughts. Now, what Kevin and I do as REBT therapists is we help you tune into and identify these automatic or habitual thoughts. And then once you do that, once you are aware through therapy usually of what your musts and shoulds are, then it's easier to identify them and sometimes even be more aware of what you're thinking at the time, and it doesn't seem as automatic. In order to identify your demands, it's useful to think of the three main demands people have. One is a demand on oneself. I must do well and get approval or else I'm no good, and that leads to anxiety, depression, and guilt. The second demand is a demand on others. You must treat me well, fairly, and kindly, and if you don't, you're no good. And the third is a demand on the conditions of one's life, not on the impersonal conditions, not on oneself or others, and that takes a form of life must be fair, easy, and hassle-free, and if it's not, I'll be miserable forever, so I better escape in addictions or procrastination. So that's a basic outline of this approach and some of the main underlying ideas here. Niraj, did you have another question or further questions about what Kevin and I said?
Yeah, so I think your explanation was very valuable, particularly when Kevin explained habitual thinking and automatic thoughts. I think that was a valuable input. Now, I want to move further.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. Yeah. And that you talked about Freud having a lot of fantasies. And in that regard, I have a question. What Jordan Peterson is making an argument against, probably against the cognitive psychology. And his argument is, in one of the talks he said that now the cognitive psychologists focus on hypothesis generation. Okay. Then the second part is testing. And then the third part is generalizing it to the outside world, or generalizing it to the masses. And here he made an argument that they focus on the second and third step, that is the testing and generalizing it to the overall overall masses. But his argument is they do not focus on hypothesis generation. Where does this hypothesis came from? They don't talk about that.
Who's they? Niraj, who's they? Say they don't do this, they don't do that.
I think he's probably referring to cognitive psychologists.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah. So his argument is hypothesis generation. It is assumed that it comes from the deduction and induction of logical thinking, but it may not be so. So hypothesis generation, when somebody argues that Freud has had fantasies, but when the cognitive psychologists talked about hypothesis generation, are they not fantasies, or where do they come from? That is never questioned.
Yeah, so that's a reasonable question. And hypothesis generation comes from a few things. And one is knowing about human nature and how human nature think. So that's more empirical. You learn about human nature through study. And then the other one, hypothesis generation, comes from knowing about specific clients and what they deal with. So as I got more experience with clients, I was more and more able to identify their irrational thinking. Of course, I asked them, does this ring true? And through the years, I got better and better at identifying this. So it comes from that also. So from experience in working with people and from knowing about human nature and the way they think, and also by inference. So if someone touches a stove and quickly pulls their hand away, you can infer they felt pain when they touched the stove. You may be wrong, but that's a reasonable inference. So that's another place that comes from. Kevin, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, actually, Niraj, I have a question. When you're talking about hypothesis generation, are you talking about the general hypotheses in REBT and CBT about emotional disturbance, or are you talking about the hypotheses that clients form when they're appraising a situation?
Yeah, the way I look at it is that let's look at the REBT hypothesis. The example you just now gave, that you saw your wife texting and you felt angry or jealous or whatever it is. And then the B is the hypothesis which you meant, that she must not
Right.
text. And then you test that hypothesis. But the question is, how did you come to this hypothesis?
Oh, I see. So how would a client arrive at that hypothesis? Well,
Yeah.
the basic idea is, this is, I think a lot of us have our own personal take on where these beliefs have their origin, but quite often we do formulate different ideas about how the world works as we're growing up. We get certain ideas are reinforced, and then we continue to reinforce them. And so that forms the basis, and these usually manifest in this three broad families of beliefs that we affectionately refer to them as the three major musts. All of us have beliefs about ourselves, functional and dysfunctional. We have beliefs about others, functional and dysfunctional, and we have beliefs about our lives, both functional and dysfunctional. And so what happens is, when I see something, going back to my example, or could be anybody, they see their spouse texting somebody, that's the activating event. And immediately, and mood, there is a sort of feedback loop here that takes place. We know, for example, empirically, that when people are experiencing depressed mood, that tends to influence their cognitions and vice versa. But anyway, without getting into the weeds there, somebody looks at they see their spouse texting somebody, and immediately one of these major musts becomes activated, or one of their beliefs becomes activated, and it stems from their general philosophy about what should or must happen. And that's what leads to the emotional consequences. So where we intervene is we help people identify those beliefs, and we help them modify them to be more flexible, usually the form of preferences, sometimes humor, things like that. So the hypothesis the client forms about the world stems from, in CBT, we would call it their core beliefs. In REBT, we would talk about the three major musts. So these are beliefs that are there. They're very rigid, they're very strong, and they're notoriously difficult, but not impossible, to root out.
Yeah, and I want to add to that excellent explanation that well, let me back up a little. Kevin was referring to ABC, the activating event, which is a situation. B is your irrational belief about it, if you have an irrational belief about it, and C is your disturbed emotion. If you have an irrational belief, that leads to a disturbed emotion. And I'm not so happy about calling A an activating event, because it sort of implies that when you see your wife texting, it's going to activate this belief in your mind. I'd rather call it an antecedent event, because if you see your wife texting, you could think, oh, she's texting her friend Mary, or you could think nothing of it because you're preoccupied with other things while you're watching her text. So, so I prefer that kind of terminology. What do you think, Kevin?
Well, I agree with you. If we talk about classic behaviorism, it is the antecedent. I tend to think of these irrational beliefs that we have, and all of us have them. Every last blessed one of us has these irrational beliefs floating around. I see them as being dormant mental structures that are just kind of there. And depending on, there are lots of things in play that we're probably not even aware of scientifically yet. But I like that term activating event, because it seems to bam, it just seems to bring it out. And so that's why I like it. Technically, I think you're correct. It's an antecedent, but I'm not going to quibble.
Okay, very good, Kevin. And Niraj, we're nearing the end of the program. Did you have a last read?
Yeah. So I have one sub question in this. The argument which I wanted to make, if I can play devil's advocate, and that is that we disregard Freud's theories as fantasies. Okay, but or probably Freud hypothesis as fantasies. But Jordan Peterson wanted to argue that the hypothesis generation is also a kind of it can also be a kind of fantasy. That is the assumption that the hypothesis generation in case of REBT, that the musts are the root cause of the emotional disturbance, is also hypothesis generation, and it is assumed that it is where does it come from? It is assumed that it is come from some logical deduction, but is it true?
Is what true? What I'm calling a fantasy true?
I am saying that many of the Freud's hypotheses are disregarded as fantasies.
Yeah, right.
And in REBT also we propose some hypotheses.
Yes.
And Jordan Peterson's argument, it seems, is that they are because of some logical deductions. But is it so? The psychologists never question where does hypothesis came from. They are more focused on the testing part, proving it that it is false, and then generalizing to the principle.
Yeah, that's one difference between REBT and other cognitive behavior therapy. We do hypothesize where it comes from, and we have an answer, and that is it comes from our human nature, our biological predispositions, and it comes to some extent from our experience and what we learn from people around us. So that's where it comes from. Now, Jordan Peterson is an interesting character, and I did a episode on Jordan Peterson. I think it was with David Ramsey Steele. And he builds himself, in his book, 12 Rules for Life, he builds himself as a cognitive behavior therapist. And then everything else he says is based on Freud and Jung, which is very strange. But so I agree that we generate hypotheses, which you could call fantasies. I think the difference between a fantasy and a hypothesis is a fantasy is a hypothesis that has no evidence to support it. And so maybe it's demeaningly called a fantasy, whereas we call our hypotheses just hypotheses that could be looked at empirically. Well, we don't have more time right now, so I just wanted to conclude by thanking you, Niraj, for coming on and making this a particularly interesting, thought-provoking program. I really appreciate that. Great questions. And thanks, Kevin Benbow, REBT therapist in Yuma, Arizona, and Chris Rossini, our tech engineer, without whose help this probably wouldn't be happening. And I'd like you to comment below if you have any questions or thoughts about what we discussed. Put in questions if you have questions. Volunteer to be on the program like Niraj did. Looks like he survived. And so please join us on a program. And donate to Patreon to support our episodes. And tune into 3-Minute Therapist podcast next week to stay on the rational side of life.